New unemployment numbers out today. 860,000 Americans filed for first-time unemployment benefits last week. And while the coronavirus continues to ravage the economy, President Trump is promising he can get it back on track and bring back jobs. NBC News senior business correspondent Stephanie Ruhle has more on whether his message is working.
Gotti, people vote based on the economy. And despite the fact that today we learned another 860,000 Americans filed for unemployment in the last week, another 12 million Americans are eligible but haven't been able to get unemployment benefits. And according to new data from Yelp, 60% of restaurants that temporarily shut down at the beginning of COVID are going to be shut down for good. Despite all of this, President Trump still polls better on all economic issues, and specifically with Latino voters. It's important to remember, people vote based on what affects them, not offends them. And one issue that many strategists are saying now Joe Biden and other Democrats are missing are economic issues. They matter so much to Latino voters, like they do all voters. And traditionally, we have seen Democrats, including Joe Biden, focus on things like immigration and deportation. And those are important issues. Let's be honest. People who are at risk of getting deported aren't eligible to vote. And if you actually look deeper at the demographic, Latinos are the fastest growing demographic in terms of entrepreneurship and small business ownership. And we know how important taxes and regulation are to them. Now, if you actually dig into policies, President Trump doesn't have policies that are specifically benefiting them. And when you look at the economic impact of COVID, it's disproportionately hurt the Latino community. So right now, this is a very important messaging game. And with less than 50 days to go before this election and a demographic that matters huge to both candidates, whether it's in Florida or other swing states like Arizona, they've got to focus on the right messaging and the right policy for Latino voters. They're one of the groups that care a lot about the economy.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.